Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are live now, and you have all been instructed how this event will be performing. So let me start this really major event of the Max Weber program. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dorothee Bohle. I'm the director of the Max Weber program at the EUI. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this very special event today. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato as our distinguished guest this afternoon. So the Max Weber program at the EUI is a multidisciplinary program, and it seeks to leverage a better and more encompassing understanding of our world around us by fostering the dialogue among different disciplines in the social sciences. And I could just not imagine a better speaker for the final year, session of the year, this very special year, than Mariana Mazzucato, who is professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London and the director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Her work spans economics and political science, and she is a source of inspiration for economists, political scientists, lawyers, and historians alike. My only real regret is that given the circumstances, I cannot be welcoming you in person, Mariana. But I'm thrilled that you have accepted our invitation to deliver the talk over Zoom. Thank you so much for being with us today. In this event, the Max Weber program is actually joining forces with Rethinking Economics in Bologna. And I'm very pleased to welcome the students from Rethinking Economics in the audience as well. Therefore, before I hand over the floor to Eleanor Woodhouse, who is a Max Weber Fellow at the EUI at the Economics Department and who will introduce our speaker today, I first hand it to Adelaide Fabi from Rethinking Economics to say a few words. So Adelaide, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Adelaide Fabi, and I've been a member of Rethinking Economics Bologna and Rethinking Economics Italia for 4 years. Rethinking is a group of students, teachers and academics promoting pluralism in the economic field. And that means methodological, interdisciplinary, and also theoretical pluralism. Our intent is not only to make the economic theory more accessible, but also to bridge the gap between the theory learned into the classes of the universities and the real world economic issues. The main purpose for us is to integrating the different economic theories, the different school of thoughts, and also other social sciences. In order to do so, we usually do this kind of activities, so like seminars, reading group, and we work within the university. And this situation, this moment in the world, give us the possibility to restart thinking about economics as it was in 2009. In fact, it is not a coincidence that the rethinking movement was born after the financial crisis. And as at that time, we are wondering how economy should be rethought. And our thesis, our complaint is that the mainstream economic is not answering some questions that are dealing with the real world. And as we probably will see during this afternoon, a topic like the role of the state is a great example of this contradiction in the mainstream economics. In fact, I was reading Professor Mazzucato article with Professor Andreoni, and they wrote that the idea that the state is a burden on the market economy has been debunked during the COVID, during this crisis. But if I think of what I learned during my years of university, the idea of the state was always that it needed to have a minimal part in the economic activity, and that it is only allowed to fix market failure. So we are very happy to have the possibility to restart thinking about this topic, to restart a debate, and So thank you very much for giving us this possibility. So thank you very much to Max Weber program and to Professor Mazzucato.
Thank you very much, Adelaide. So Eleanor, the floor is yours now to introduce our guest of honor today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Doro and Adelaide. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Max Weber lecture on rethinking value creation for a post-COVID recovery that is inclusive and sustainable. My name is Eleanor Woodhouse, a current Max Weber Fellow here at the EUI and an incoming Assistant Professor in Public Policy at UCL. And on behalf of the EUI, Rethinking Economics and the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL, we're very happy to welcome you to this joint event, which is being live streamed on YouTube. So welcome to all of the attendees, wherever you may be. So we are delighted to have with us today Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who is Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at University College London, where she is founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Mariana is a hugely influential figure in both the academic and public spheres, something I would argue is particularly valuable in these times of such uncertainty where, more urgently than ever before, we need policymakers and experts to collaborate effectively. As well as advising a range of policymakers around the world on innovation-led, inclusive and sustainable growth, the Italian Prime Minister, the OECD, the UN, just to name a few, she is frequently interviewed by the mainstream press to communicate her ideas to the broader public. I've had the pleasure of listening to her interview on Desert Island Discs, the apex of recognition for exceptional careers in the eyes of many British people. Mariana has published extensively, and I sadly do not have time here to do justice to her body of work, but I would like to highlight two of her solo authored books, given their impact and relevance for the topic we'll be discussing today. So Mariana's 2013 book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, investigates the critical role the state plays in driving growth, with its debunking of the myth of a cumbersome bureaucratic state as opposed to a dynamic, innovative private sector. This is a topic that is very close to my heart and my own research interests, and that is important to keep in mind as we face the fiscally constrained months and perhaps years that await us. The ways in which government and the private sector are able to share risks may well define how we emerge from the present crisis. More recently, in her 2018 book, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, Mariana addresses how value creation needs to be rewarded over value extraction. As we will be discussing today, this is a topic of urgent relevance if we are to rethink how our societies look and create sustainable solutions to the types of problems that COVID-19 has brought to light, including gaping inequalities, underfunded welfare states, and a lack of private sector recognition of responsibility for shared obstacles. With that, I will conclude and reiterate from all of us at the EUI and the other institutions involved, our warmest welcome to Mariana. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much to you all for this wonderful introduction, and especially the collaboration that in the end we were able to foster between Rethinking Economics and your lecture series. And I too really wish I could be there, Doro, in the beautiful, part of where your institution is, in the hills of Florence. We had wonderful weather here in London until today. So it'll be better for working. It's been very hard to work with the best weather we've ever had and yet not being able to have all the fun we normally are able to have because of the lockdown. Anyway, so thank you so much. I'm now going to share the screen, which is always dangerous because you never know which email or strange family photo will show up. So hold on, now I will. If you don't mind, I'm going to keep it like this so I see the next slides coming. Is it big enough on your screen? It's good? Should be fine? Good. So what I'd like to do is to give the talk I was going to give, but to do so in light of everything we're learning day by day on the kind of key lessons around COVID-19, which I'm sure everyone will agree has not only created a massive kind of health crisis, but has along the way revealed other types of crises that we have had, which are much more structural. For example, our crisis, in some ways you could call it crisis of the welfare state, which we need to hopefully reimagine now that we've all realized that we're only as healthy as our neighbor is, literally on our street, in our city, in our nation, and across nations. So we really need to be strengthening global health systems as a result of this crisis, but that's hard to do unless there's a framing of what we even mean by public services or public purpose and public value, two concepts I'll introduce during the talk, as embedded within how we design those very services. I would argue that part of the reason that those services are in crisis is precisely because of how we've misvalued them. And it's quite ironic, or in some ways an opportunity, now that we all, I don't know in Italy what the word is, but here in the UK, we call it the key workers, in the US, essential workers. What is the word for the Italians there in the room that you've called your health workers? Is it lavori essenziali, chiavi? Non so. So at least here we've been clapping on Thursdays, the key workers and the health services. And yet, if we've misvalued our health services, the real question is, what does it mean to value, to resource, to reimagine, to strengthen, to make more resilient those very services and that part of the economy in some ways that they're servicing? And I do think that a wake-up call to the need to reimagine in the same way that Beveridge did early on, at least in the UK, what we even expect from our welfare state, and so doing, what is the role of the state itself in the economy? And as you said in the kind introductions, I've been thinking a lot about the role of the state. And we should always remember also in this talk, when I say the state, it's not, big brother, blob, massive institution. It's actually often a decentralized network of, hundreds of institutions, as different as the BBC, a public broadcaster, to a public bank, to a Department of Education. And each and every one of them will have actually a perception of what their remit is. And that's not independent of how we in society think about actually the role of the state in 21st century capitalism. So that's going to be one of the things I'd like to unpick and converse with you about, especially in the context of these kind of key lessons from COVID-19. So what the talk is officially about is rethinking value creation with a direction, right? So these words I've put there: innovation-led, inclusive, sustainable, or if we think of it as a, using some other words, a healthy, smart, green deal. All these words are really about admitting that economic growth has not just a rate, but a direction. And even though that's obvious to some people, especially normal citizens, sometimes we forget that in economic theory, because so much of the kind of narrative that we then have of the policy side is kind of about leveling the playing field, which is not about tilting it towards a direction. So what are the tools? What's the framing? What's literally the theory? And what does that mean for designing the tools to direct an economy, whether that direction is on something as specific as a Green New Deal, or the kind of big challenges that have been in Europe for a long time: smart, sustainable, inclusive, or, since, 2005, we got the Sustainable Development Goals. Forget, or was this 2015? Unfortunately, I can't interact with you guys. Someone should put up a number. Anyway, the SDGs, which have not been around forever, they're quite recent. Historically, they are themselves a direction for growth. They are 17 goals, very specific. Underneath them are even more specific targets, 169 targets. And really the question is, what's the framing that we actually need to think about that direction that's required to actually meet those goals? Otherwise, we should get rid of them. They're just kind of a bullshitting opportunity for talking, but not for walking. And then, of course, there's also the return of industrial strategy in many countries, not all. And that itself becomes an opportunity to ask, well, what do we mean by industrial strategy? Is it just kind of picking a list of sectors that we then throw money at? Or what does it mean to really foster an industrial strategy that catalyzes new forms of collaboration across the whole economy, with strong industrial capabilities, of course, but also about, again, solving key problems? So, a Green Deal obviously requires lots of different sectors to transform themselves. What's the, interaction between a strong industrial strategy that is also directed towards achieving some big goals? Anyway, so that's just the kind of positive start to the talk, which is a great time to be rethinking the direction of growth, because actually all these directed opportunities or talk is there. I'm not making this up. There's so much talk around all these different areas, including some others. And it's also a good time to be talking about kind of value creation and rethinking it and directed growth, because as you'll know, for some time now, at least 2-3 years, the business community, and I'm talking about literally some of the top businesses, have been rethinking their corporate governance structure and looking for change. At least, again, the talk is there. So already back in 2018, there was a famous letter by Larry Fink, which you'll see here, where he said we need to rediscover our purpose, basically, and that without that sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential. And that was, basically a call to actually be more long-termist, to sacrifice some of the short-term investments that were just looking at current profits, look at long-run growth, and what that meant for investing in employee development, innovation, capital expenditures that were all about the long run. And that was echoed then 1 year later in August of last year. So we're coming to the anniversary of this famous letter that the Business Roundtable, so 180 CEOs basically said the same thing. And in fact, Davos this year, where I had the pleasure or mispleasure to be, that was the talk of the town. It was all about, we got to rethink things, maximizing shareholder value has kind of screwed things up. Let's do it for real. And unfortunately, I would argue there's great initiatives, but it's all very patchy. In some sectors, some businesses, some corporate governance models, some conferences like Davos, there might be talk about it, but it hasn't actually, this real systemic and transparent, and in some ways mandatory, change in corporate governance hasn't happened. And so what I'm going to argue in the talk is that it's got to happen. It's got to happen in order to address the biggest problems of our time. And I kind of start off with 5 of them, but I'm sure we could now make a longer list. I'll then talk about why this requires a new framing. And then I'm going to give examples of what that framing might look like based on my own experience in advising the governments and institutions that I have been advising. And I've been told to speak maximum 40 to 45 minutes, and I have a timer here, so you will be glad to know I will not go over that. And I would like as much discussion as we can have as possible about any of the elements I'm talking about. So first, just to make sure we're all on the same wavelength of just how bad things are. And I'm kind of reminding you what the problems were before COVID, because I could give you a whole list of huge things that obviously are even worse given the current health pandemic we're going through, but I'm sure you all know that because it's much more immediate. But the kind of 5 structural problems, I would argue, one is the kind of financial sector which we've allowed to develop has basically been fueling most of its finance towards itself. This graph here is from the Bank of England. I need to update it. I think this went to about 2015. It's from the Bank of England, as I mentioned in a famous article that Andy Haldane wrote, where he just showed how much financial intermediation as a percentage of gross value added was basically outpacing the rest of the economy. And in looking at some of the sources, he and many others, including some of my colleagues like Josh Ryan Collins at IIPP, the institute I run, we're finding that that one way to literally sum this up is that the reason that financial intermediation has been growing so much compared to the rest is it's been financing itself and not the rest. So you would hope that most of finance actually greases the wheels of the economy. Instead, in many countries like in the UK, you see here in the graph, over like only about 20% of the finance actually goes into non-financial businesses. Most of it goes into FIRE. It sounds nice, or it doesn't sound nice, but it sounds dramatic as it is, which is finance, insurance, and real estate. So the acronym is handily FIRE. So when 80% of your finance goes back into FIRE, that can potentially create major structural problems because of the lack of also kind of patient long-term finance to fuel the kind of long-term growth that we require that I've been talking about in the beginning. And the second problem is that it's not just about finance versus the real economy, it's the real economy itself has become financialized. And people like Bill Lazonik, a co-author of mine, and some others have been really focused on this problem, as have I in some recent writings, including in my books, but specifically in some articles I wrote with Bill Lazonik, which looked at different indicators that you might look at to kind of measure the gravity of this problem. And so just in the last 10 years, the Fortune 500 companies have spent close to, over $3 trillion in their profits in terms of share buybacks. And this basically leads to a lack of reinvestment back in the real economy. So their own productive capacity, but also things like, worker training programs, research and development, all those kind of long run areas. And it's not that all share buybacks are wrong. I should have put up here another table where you can actually look at how it's divided by industry. In some cases, it might not be that much, but in many sectors and specific firms, you have sometimes over 100% of net income actually being spent on a combination actually of dividend payouts and share buybacks. And that degree of the use of share buybacks has actually been increasing over time. And when you ask companies, why are you doing that? Why aren't you reinvesting? Often the excuse is there's no investment opportunities. So that's one of the questions I'll be asking. Is that true? Or is this really just a failed, in some way, social compact between also business and government in terms of this lack of reinvestment back into the economy? But basically the macroeconomic consequence of that you see in both the UK and the US, which are two of the greatest share buyback countries in terms of falling business investment. So the I part of GDP will suffer when funds are not being reinvested back in, but extracted out. Again, a subject that I'll come to again throughout. Third, one could argue that there's a huge inequality problem. Again, different in different countries, but one of the reasons that there was such a high level actually of private debt, which basically caused the financial crisis in the US, was that in many ways, workers and people on kind of normal income, so not the famous 1%, had to take out debt in order just to retain their existing living standards because of the fall in real wages or stagnant real wages. There's people who've written why this is, in some cases lack of bargaining power in terms of the weakness of unions over time, but also the role of technology and labor displacing technology, the forces of globalization. We could go on and look at why this is, but the general result that there's been a kind of a lack of labor power, in terms of economic power, can be even just seen in terms of the record level of the capital share in GDP compared to the labor share. So the labor share of GDP is been falling over time. So again, that's just sort of a fact. And then again, why that is, you'll have different theories, which I'm just putting it out there as a fact. Fourth problem of the five, I'll speed up, is climate. And I don't have to remind you that in January and February, just this year, we weren't clapping the health workers, which at least in London here, we've been clapping on Thursdays. I know in countries like Spain and Italy, there was claps almost every night. We were clapping, or at least congratulating and wishing our best to the fire workers in California and Australia, the fires that are just a symbol of the climate crisis, or the flood workers in Venice. But the point is, this is a huge crisis that's looming on top of us, and both the IPCC and the IEA, different organizations have been trying to warn us, and Greta Thunberg and all the Young Fridays for the Future students have been telling us to do the basic thing, which is listen to the science, look at the science, things are not good. And that remains there. We might have had a shortfall in some polluting sources in terms of less planes in the sky, but we haven't come even close to solving what the targets what the scientists tell us the targets should be. Lastly, the state has a huge problem, right? So there is finance, business, inequality, climate. The state, it's sort of, it's just the framing of how we've thought about the role of the state has been problematic itself. So it's always, in terms of all these crises, whether it's COVID with the health pandemic or the climate crisis or reacting to the financial crisis, it seems to always just be reacting to waiting for something to fall apart and then fixing it, which is not a surprise, because that's even how we frame the role of the state in economics. It's about fixing market failures. And I argue, this is my subjective opinion, that even though we have all these market failures, and this is actually a useful framework for understanding why markets might fail, but given that these failures are constantly happening, it's almost like we've decided that normality is about failure, which obviously means that perhaps we have the wrong understanding of how markets operate, if then the only way we can talk about the role of policy is by fixing something. Not only that, but the big changes that have occurred over the last 200 years, whether it's technological revolutions or the advent of important institutions like those welfare state institutions I was talking about at the beginning, be very hard to talk about them as having come about solely through, at least on the public side, a market fixing process. What I will argue is we require something much more akin to a market co-creation, market shaping process. But the fact that the state continues to think of itself through its, bureaucrats, the civil servants, the public service institutions as market failure fixing, that itself has led to a problem of the state often being too little too late. And we definitely have seen this. We might talk about it more in the discussion with COVID-19, the kind of lack of real governance capacity to govern such a major crisis. Anyway, so what I argue in this talk and in my book, The Value of Everything, is that it's going to be very hard to change things unless we really start thinking about how these different problems are interlinked. They're not just like random 5 problems, they're fundamentally linked. And the way I approached it in my recent book was to kind of unpick what the problems are in terms of how we think about value. Obviously, that's not the only problem. It's just one of the lenses which I tried to bring to the table. And I'm going to go through a very quick history of how economic theory has thought about the value question. And I'm just going to do that semi-superficially, but especially just to look at what are the implications, what is the connection between how we think about value and then how we think about really important things like how to account for growth, how to think about corporate governance in the ways that the Business Roundtable say we need to change, how we think about the fair price for a drug, how we think about governing our digital platforms, which, as you know, today are back on the agenda, not only because of the power of tech companies under COVID, but also the digital divide itself, which for me, at least with 4 children at home, I'm really realizing just how big it is in terms of the different opportunities that kids have right now at home in terms of their educational prospects. Anyway, so as I said, I'm going to do this quite quickly. And the real thing that I want to kind of get across in this slide is that, it's not framed right, here we go, is that, how we've thought about value has changed a lot over the last kind of 400 years, you could argue. And it's often been linked to what was actually happening underlying the economy. So it's not a coincidence that in the 1600s, in a period in long distance trade, and where there was a lot of emphasis on exchange rates and actually free trade acts, so the 1651 navigation acts, that a lot of the underlying premise was that value itself came from exchange. And hence all the attention there was at the time on both exchange rates and the structure of free trade. Similar in some ways, I would argue, as Trump's view of what the problems are, just get kind of the free trade agreement right and somehow it's all going to work, as opposed to a real focus on kind of the underlying investment and productive capacity. That changed in the 1700s and the 1800s with a much greater focus on what I would call objective conditions of production themselves. So in the agricultural period of the physiocrats, during the agricultural revolution, the physiocrats, who were mainly in France, they were really focused on the degree to which farm labor, let me just go to their nice little table here, how farm labor itself was the source of value. And they were very concerned through this, what I call this first spreadsheet ever here, the Tableau Économique, made by Francois Penet. I rewrote this for you in this nice little Excel version of it. They were mainly concerned at how the value that they thought was being produced by the class that they called the productive class, or the farmers, the degree to which that was actually reinvested back into the economy versus siphoned out. So they were worried that the proprietors and the sterile class, and these were respectively the merchants and the landlords, if there was too much being siphoned out to either fight wars or to simply kind of set up shop or to clothe the kings and the queens, they really thought that eventually that this would put at risk the reproduction of the system itself. So the real focus was kind of plotting out with an objective lens on how value is being created in the economy, in the agricultural kind of land area, and then focus a lot on those reproductive circles there. And the classicals, who were instead, this is a classical economist like David Ricardo, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Smith was first, they did something similar, but not focused on farming, but on industrial kind of labor and factories due to the Industrial Revolution, not the agricultural revolution. But they too really looked a lot at the productive capacity of where they thought value was being formed, which was in industrial labor. And so Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he had that famous story about the pin factory and how the division of labor between all the different pin workers, that, you know, if you actually had a division of labor across 18 different functions to create a pin, that would massively increase productivity, growth, and hence the wealth of nations if you kind of aggregated up this increase in productive capacity across all different factories. And so they were very concerned also actually with the degree to which the value that was being created in the industrial structures was reinvested back in to both kind of organizational innovation around the division of labor, but also, and especially in Ricardo's and then Marx's time, they were asking what would actually happen in the economy in terms of these profits being reinvested also in machinery. So Marx himself, as you'll remember, he thought that that capitalist profits actually came from exploiting labor. And one of the questions he asked was, what's going to happen when all these machines actually take over the labor? Does that mean the profit rate's going to fall? But regardless of what their kind of individual theories were, because they were actually quite different one from another, they all share this emphasis on real kind of focus on objective relationships between value, prices, and conditions of production. They also looked at power relationships like the class struggle, but they really focused first on value, and then that actually led to a theory of price. And they also, like the physiocrats, were very concerned with, again, not just surplus value in the sense of Marx, but also rent itself, rent as a form of extraction of value. And they actually called rent unearned income, which is very different from how rent is called today in neoclassical economics, where it's almost seen as a result of some imperfect competition, which in theory at least can be competed away in the long run if you get rid of some sort of institutional barriers or monopoly power. But the fact that there was this objective lens looking at the division of labor and actually being able to look at certain functions as really just moving stuff around and not creating anything new, not necessarily related to monopoly power, but literally unearned income, was actually a unique feature of their rent theory. And we have a new big project, I should let you know in case people are interested in this, in IIPP, funded by the Midier Foundation, which is looking at a modern theory of economic rents and actually plotting it across different sectors. But just in case I forgot to tell you that later. But again, they, like the physiocrats, had this focus on reproduction, which is interesting because that's by definition then makes you worry about these kind of value flows. And what basically then happened in neoclassical economics, and again, I'm being very generalistic here, I know this can be annoying, but if you're going to go through 400 years of economic history, that's the only thing to do. And then we can debate later some of the details. But that the focus basically moved along two ways. One, there was no longer the initial focus on value, which then would lead to a theory of price, like in classical economic theory. It was the reverse. There was an emphasis on price and supply and demand curves, and what actually led to an upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and that equilibrium price would kind of reveal value. And second, the focus moved from being objective, and by objective, I don't mean deterministic. I literally mean looking at production, who's doing what and who gets what and why, to put it that way, of the classical focus, to one focus on subjective. And by subjective, I don't mean kind of random, like people's opinions. I literally mean focus on the individual. So everyone's maximizing their individual preferences, and preferences are more subjective than, say, the division of labor in a factory. So consumers maximizing their utility, firms maximizing their profits, workers maximizing their preferences for leisure versus work decisions. And so this massive shift from focused on price to value, I sometimes joke is why it also becomes really easy for someone like the head of Goldman Sachs, just 1 year after the biggest financial crisis of our time, after the Great Depression, to be completely confident when he said Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. Because he's right, if you're actually measuring value by price, then if you're earning a lot, you must be very valuable. So it kind of becomes this tautology. If you don't actually have a theory of value, then are particular financial services creating value or not? Is there unearned income? All these fundamental questions about reproduction and rents in both the physiocrats and the classicals kind of just disappears. Again, I'm being a bit general, but anyway, it's still funny that he could say that just 1 year after his company got bailed out by $10 billion by the U.S. taxpayer. But you know, how we measure value actually allows productivity then to look very high for a company like Goldman Sachs. So what I do in the book, and I don't want to focus too much on that because I do want to make sure that at least my last 15 minutes or 10 minutes at least towards the end are focused on the kind of new way to think and what we're learning around the world and implementing that. But what I do in the book, Value of Everything, is look at why any of this matters. You know, is it just about showing, you know, wow, big changes in how value theory is talked about? No, it actually matters a lot to how we understand, again, who earns what and why. In that way, I was just talking about what happens when you confuse price with value, and you know, what does that do to our understanding of, you know, who is more deserving of what they're earning, can it, you know, who is more productive, but also what we count in GDP, how we measure or how we think about governance of organizations, and some of the recent debates about governance and shareholder value as being problematic or not. It affects how we think of, as I mentioned, the just price for something like medicines, how we think we can govern digital platform capitalism, and the role of the state itself. And I wrote a lot about the role of the state in my previous book, The Entrepreneurial State. So, you know, quickly what I mean by this is, you know, if, for example, with GDP, if we're only including in it what has a price, we already know from lots of literature, both feminist economics and environmental economists, that there's all these weird things that happen. Like if you marry your babysitter, you know, GDP goes down. If you pollute, GDP goes up. But I think what's less appreciated is actually what happened to finance with GDP. And that kind of alludes to those earlier graphs I was showing, the Andy Haldane Bank of England ones. So basically up until 1970, most of finance, at least the income that was being generated from net interest payments, so the difference between interest earned and interest paid out, was not being included actually in GDP. It was basically, they didn't talk about it that way, but they were basically alluding to this notion, you know, in the classicals of rent really is just kind of moving money around, not actually doing anything new. And so it was treated as a transfer. The net interest payments were treated as a transfer in the same way that Social Security payments don't go into GDP, because it's just a transfer of income from one place to another. And what's interesting there is that because the sector started growing, and there's different reasons for that I talk about in the book, and also earning income, this idea that, oh, it's earning income, so it must be valuable, kind of came in. And so they just put it into GDP. And you can look at the history of that through the systems of national accounting debates, also in the UN, the SNA, System of National Accounts, and where they also tried to standardize this across countries. But there was no kind of pause. They didn't do what the physiocrats did and say, well, actually, wait, who's doing what and why? What is finance actually doing? Is it creating value? Or some parts of finance creating value? And are some parts of finance literally just financing themselves? Or, you know, in the ways that both Minsky and Keynes and others have talked about in terms of the dysfunctions that finance, how it evolved, there was no kind of judgment on that or objective lens on finance as a sector. It was just, here's what it's earning, put it in, it must be valuable. Third, the governance of organizations, this idea that we need to rethink it because maximization of shareholder value leads to all this short-termism, you know, the focus on quarterly returns that the Business Roundtable was talking about in the beginning. It's hard to change that unless you debunk the theory of value that is actually underpinned, that the maximization of shareholder value theory is underpinned by. And so again, Lazonic has written a lot about this, how it was actually Michael Jensen back at Harvard Business School in the 1980s who came up with this kind of grand theory of shareholder value. But what's interesting there is that it's underpinned by an idea of who's doing what, but it's a very problematic idea. So the idea is that shareholders are the biggest risk takers, and hence the residual claimants, that everyone else in the economy more or less has a guaranteed rate of return. And once everyone's paid off, the banks their interest, the workers their salaries, et cetera, then there is or there's not a residual, something left over, and that's what the shareholders get. And that's why they're considered to be the greatest risk takers, because you might not get anything. And that again is, you know, you just step back and ask, is it true that, you know, government has a guaranteed rate of return? Do workers have a guaranteed rate of return? Well, no. You know, governments, again, I've written a lot about what governments invest, and they fail many different times, and they might have invested in the internet. That was a success, but for every internet, there's many failures. That's an example of risk-taking. Or, you know, Tesla, Solyndra both got a lot of money from government. One goes bust, one goes well. In no way does government have a guaranteed rate of return, but workers also don't. Many workers begin their jobs thinking they might have a lifelong career in a company, so are willing to take on lower wages. There's no guarantee that their kind of wage path is going to follow some sort of upwards trajectory. So in that sense, they're also, one could argue, taking risks. So this lack of kind of objective, realistic kind of understanding of who's really taking risks and how, and what's the distribution of those risks across our economic landscape has fueled this kind of idea of the residual claimant, and that itself is fundamental to the theory of maximization of shareholder value. So if we do want to move away from that towards something called stakeholder value, we need to kind of go back to that value principle underlying it. The prices of medicines is one that I've written a lot about, which is, again, the lack of an objective kind of look, and this kind of idea that of a value-based pricing, which basically is an idea that you would look at what is the value that people would give to having a remedy based on what is the value that they perceive in not having that. So it's kind of like allowing prices to go to almost infinity, especially for drugs that we absolutely need. But that value-based pricing model, the reason it's problematic is, again, it doesn't provide any kind of inventory mapping, scanning exercise. Again, who's doing what and why, and who's getting what and why. And so this, you know, 40 billion a year that the US government spends on health innovation isn't captured in the prices of drugs, and also of kind of state investment, which is, again, just an objective fact in many different countries. Even vaccines today, the race for the vaccine under COVID is receiving a lot of state investment, but unless we really map that out and think about what that means in a market shaping way, not just a market fixing way, then it's going to be hard to govern the process of vaccine development to actually meet the objective of why governments are investing in it in the first place. And the reason government should invest in vaccines is we need to make sure that it's globally accessible, so everyone gets access to it, otherwise it's not going to work, but also that it becomes free at the point of use, and the huge amounts of public funds going into vaccine development. We're seeing this already today. We really have to push the idea that it needs to be done with a public perspective, given also that huge amount of public investment. And the reason I'm bringing this up as a value point is that, again, this focus on subjective conditions and not objective ones is in fact what has led to that value-based pricing model, which means that a hepatitis C drug, ended up costing 94,000 here. You see that here, 500 for a 12-week, one pill a day scope. And so combating that and combating the narrative of where the value is actually coming from requires that objective lens on where these drugs actually come from. Who owns our data is interesting because, as I was mentioning in the beginning, there's lots of talk about the power, the monopoly power that tech companies have. Philippon has just written some great work on this. Thomas Philippon from NYU. There's also talk about the kind of tax problem of how much tax evasion occurs. But having also an objective lens also means thinking objectively, what are the new structures that are required to both create but also capture the benefits from our kind of platform capitalist economy. So on the creation, we know, that's again what the entrepreneurial state was about, that, GPS, internet, it was all basically publicly financed. But then how do you capture that value, so the who owns what and why, in ways that actually makes sense, both in terms of socializing both risks and rewards, but also in Barcelona, what they did was the city mayor, Ada Colau, argued that they needed new structures, so a data commons for the city itself to be able to benefit public infrastructure, public transport. So they brought in hackers to the city team to be able to make sure that the data that was being generated by citizens when they were generating data with things like Citymapper actually flowed not just to private companies that then, all those privacy issues, but flowed to the welfare state itself. But that needed a new structure. So that information flow that would improve public transport, again, new structures that are also about making sure that we have, more equitable, more sustainable economies. But in terms of the data production, where does data actually come from? And how to distribute the rewards requires something that goes beyond a price focus and a subjective focus. And the last thing, it obviously has a lot to do how we think about value and how we think about government. A lot of government services are free. We know how to value the inputs, the salary of a teacher, the salary of a nurse will go into GDP, but we still haven't mastered how to actually value the benefits of a well-structured public healthcare system, public education system. And it's not a coincidence that we talk about the cost of healthcare, the cost of public education, because basically that's what we're putting in to the books. We don't actually look at the value of what that produces, but also this notion that governments are there, just as I mentioned, fixing, means that we've also literally not even understood historically the role that these much more active, proactive state investments have played, which have created markets, not just fixed them. So again, all the things that make our iPhones smart, but also most renewable energy technologies came from early stage, high risk state investments, including shale, so not just solar and wind. But then the question is kind of, what does that then mean for how we distribute the returns from this massive co-creation of value machine, as opposed to just a market fixing one? I'll come back to that as my last slide. So the reason I set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose was really to reflect more on these kind of last topics that I just mentioned, which is, if you really believe that value is actually co-created by different types of public, private, and third sector institutions, what does that mean to bring kind of the purpose side of things? How do you get a more purposeful system, not just purposeful corporate governance organization? What does it mean to think about issues like public value, put them at the center of how we think about value itself, both in the sense of the public sector can co-create value, but also the public, different institutions and how they're structured create this collective wealth creation process that is not about the production function where value creation occurs and everything else is just kind of either fixing or facilitating that. So what does it mean to really bring collective value creation to the center of how we think about the economy? And a lot of what we do is we think the narrative along the way, so literally changing the terms, like co-creating and shaping, not de-risking but welcoming uncertainty, not leveling but tilting towards a direction, that first point I made early on. And what does it mean to really increase the capacity of all the different creators of value? So not just within private institutions, but what would dynamic capabilities look like within the public sector? And also, how do we evaluate processes which are fundamentally dynamic, where the role of government is not just, again, to fix a market failure, but to shape, and to do so with strong notions of public purpose? How would you evaluate whether you kind of achieved your objective or not? And given that a lot of evaluation occurs through cost benefit analysis, net present value, do we need more dynamic indicators? So I'm getting to the end, which is good because my time is up in 5 minutes. And so what I tried to do in recent years was kind of to go beyond the critique about, why the economy is kind of messed up, why there's this limited notion of government, why we need to rethink, both corporate governance, but also public governance structures. And I advised the European Union in an opportunity that I had, which was a special advisor of Carlos Moedas, at the time, he's now gone, the innovation commissioner, to think about this notion of kind of a purpose-driven economy, right? So coming back to my first slide on, if we want a directed growth to achieve particular goals, smart, sustainable, inclusive, what does that actually mean for changes in the way that we need to think about policy, but also the link between public sector and private sector? And so this concept of missions that I've written a lot about kind of started with that. The idea was, if we're going to take the Sustainable Development Goals seriously, let's, really have a challenge-led, mission-oriented approach. Thinking back at what got us to the moon, there was a challenge, which was the Sputnik kind of Cold War moment, but the mission was much, much more concrete. It was to get to the moon and back again in one generation. And that wasn't just public sector. There was lots of private sector initiative. There was, innovation by Goldman Sachs, oh my God, General Electric, Honeywell, Motorola. They were central. There was lots of different sectors. So it wasn't just aeronautics. It was materials, nutrition, electronics. The whole software industry actually came out as a reflection of that. But at the project level, what it meant was governments really kind of redesigning their instruments like grants, loans, and procurement to really fuel that bottom-up experimentation, mainly actually within the business community, to fulfill the goals that the public sector needed. So it wasn't like, oh, let's commercialize space, let's bring in the private sector. It was, we need a particular goal to be met and we can't do it alone. We're going to have a lot of public money, but also private investment. And we have to redesign how we write the procurement contract, or money that's given to business, in order to make sure that we're fueling innovation to solve a specific problem. So with the SDGs, whether it be climate change or here the Clean Oceans one, SDG 13 and 14, making the mission really specific, and then redesigning all the tools that government has to fuel that bottom-up experimentation, but also to really create strong conditionalities with business. So it's not about SME policy or startup policy. You don't help small companies just because they're small. You might help them because you think that they're going to be central to that experimentation process. But that requires kind of a more picking the willing, not picking winners kind of mindset. And so that was quite interesting, because that actually made this notion of missions become a legal instrument in Europe. And one of the things I often say is, well, this shouldn't make everyone comfortable. Missions mean really doing capitalism differently, how the government thinks about its relationship with business, much more about solving problems together, but also creating strong conditionalities attached to that, and making sure that funds are reinvested back into the economy, not siphoned out, as the physiocrats worried about, but making sure that that becomes mandatory to the ability of business to access anything from the 40 billion a year that governments put in the US on health innovation, but also the energy, the renewable energy investments, and the digital investments. And so in the UK, we worked closely with Theresa May's government to bring this to the industrial strategy. And the idea was, stop just making lists of sectors, focus on these 4 big challenges. And we helped them turn, for example, the challenges that they decided on, obviously, like things like future of mobility, into a concrete mission, like creating a very sustainable, accessible, safe, healthy, and resilient mobility system in the UK. And we helped them think through, what would that mean if you had the word accessible in there for the kind of innovation you need, say, in the disabilities area. But again, this created a very different logic from one that until then had just been about handing out money to SMEs or particular sectors, like the life sciences strategy. And then we work very closely, this is again the work with the Institute, with different ministries of finance around the world. In the UK, it's the Treasury, and the way they evaluate public investments, as I mentioned, is very much around cost benefit, net present value. And we asked, what would a market shaping missions approach then look like in terms of the evaluation needed? Also in terms of the finance that's required, given this problem of financing finance, if we want more patient long-term finance and not all this impatient finance, what does it mean to make sure, though, that this renewed kind of role of public finance doesn't just become, again, a handout, like in Italy, where I'm from, the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, of course, it's active, but in the past, it's been there more or less to hand out money to ailing industries, not so much in this kind of proactive, mission-oriented, purpose, strategic investment kind of lens. And so we helped create new banks, like the one in Scotland, which is explicitly a mission-oriented public bank, but also in talking precisely to banks like Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, thinking about how they can rethink their own role in a more public purpose direction, which is more tense than with business. It's not just about giving out money, but creating conditions, like happened in Germany a year ago, where the steel sector received a big loan from the public bank, the KfW, conditional on reducing their material content through repurpose, reuse, recycle. And a lot of this, again, is about rethinking distribution. So a connection between who's doing what and why, and who gets what and why. And so this whole topic of conditionality, which I've been coming back to, is precisely in order to reflect that kind of sharing both of risks and rewards, whether it's conditions on reinvestment or particular conditions on the IPR, or in some cases having equity stakes in companies that are receiving public benefit. And even though I keep talking about the state, and yet I began with rethinking capitalism, the state is everywhere. So rethinking the relationship between the state and business is about rethinking capitalism, because markets are outcomes of how public and private interact. And in the recent period with COVID-19, I just have a paper out yesterday, which Adelaide mentioned, on the conditionalities needed now in the COVID-19 moment, written with Antonio Andreoni. And the idea there is that this is what should actually always be happening. You don't just give huge amounts of public money without thinking of what kind of growth do we want. And what's interesting is this is taking off quite well in some countries, like in France, where the bailout to Air France, also in Austria, was conditional on carbon reductions, or in Denmark, conditional on not using tax havens, or in the US with Elizabeth Warren, conditioning it on not overly using share buybacks. But it's still, there seems not to be enough appetite on that. We reflected on the bailout to Fiat, to the FCA, Fiat Chrysler Corporation, which there were some conditions attached, but they weren't, how do you say, there basically is no penalty if the conditions are not met. And I often say that the reason we should care about all this is that to get a better economy, we actually need to ask ourselves, what are we valuing, but also then how do we steer the economy in that direction? And if we're not interested in directionality, that first slide, then actually none of this matters. I mean, all of this matters if we think that we can actually design our economies in ways that actually get us closer to achieving some of the most important goals of our time, including the ones that we're now living through under the health pandemic. And it's going to be very hard to address these big changes required, whether it's climate change or making our economies more healthy and resilient, unless we rethink the underlying assumptions about value that a lot of our then policies are riding on. And lastly, I put on the chat before, we've been hosting a lot of discussions about this. And tonight there's actually a session I'm hosting between two women leaders, one in London, one in Emilia Romagna, there in Italy, where some of you are sitting. Ellie Schlein, the governor of Emilia Romagna, in terms of what lessons they're learning on the governance at the local level. Because what's interesting with my experience with missions, most of those missions were easier to think about at the local level, because in a city, for example, it's very clear what needs to be done to get someone from point A to point B. But what happens along the way is what is most interesting. Anyway, so very happy now to open to questions, but also on the website of the institute that I run at UCL, there's a lot of some of the background work that we're doing with governments worldwide, from South Africa, Italy, the Vatican, around some of these issues.
Thank you very, very much. This was a great talk, great insight in both the challenges that we are facing, but also, possible solutions that what can be done. I will now be taking questions. So there is those of you who are in the room, you probably know you can raise your hand, not in the screens, but the virtual hands. And then there are those of you who listen to this from YouTube. There is somebody basically forwarding me your questions as well. So let me see whether I see anybody. And when you raise your hand and ask a question, please at least those who are in the room, please very briefly introduce yourself. So it always takes some time to digest, because this was clearly a very rich.
Too much.
But I have a first question here from YouTube. Brendan Jones. So he asked, what role do you see worker cooperatives taking? Should anyone but a worker own shares in a business? So maybe.
Okay. Should I answer that?
Yes.
Okay. So
that's.
Okay, I'll be brief so we can get to other ones. So first of all, we're actually doing a project in Mondragon, Spain, because it has one of the largest worker cooperatives in the world, 87,000 workers in an industrial cooperative. Most cooperatives nowadays are retail. Precisely to learn actually from the cooperative movement on what the implications are of cooperatives, not just again for corporate governance, but also for transition. So green transition, if we want a stakeholder perspective on the transition itself. What can we learn from regions like in Mondragon, which have had actually an intense dialogue between, civil society, business, and government. And so kind of moving the cooperative question away from just a governance of a company to governance of a transition, I think is an interesting question. But another answer is that in thinking about collective value creation, that's why then one also thinks through kind of the pre-distribution issues in terms of distribution. So we often distribute or redistribute through taxation. The more we can embed within the contracts and the relationships between economic actors ex ante, not just ex post, the idea that collectively created value should be shared collectively, the easier it will then be to also redistribute later via tax, because you'll create less of a mess along the way. So some recent work we've been doing is around citizens' dividend. I actually have a piece in the New York Times, hopefully it's coming out tomorrow, around the notion of a citizen's share, citizens' dividend, as opposed to UBI. So UBI, universal basic income, is like a handout to citizens to maybe go pursue their creativity, whereas citizens' share and citizens' dividend might be the same amount, but it's framed. The narrative is that you have a share because you created that wealth. You're not just getting a handout from the state. In fact, I think it's not a coincidence that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs love UBI, because it doesn't debunk the idea that they're the only ones creating wealth. So I think the cooperative question should be about also a reframing of where wealth is coming from, and thinking through multiple different ways in which risks can be not just socialized in their creation, but also in their the distribution of the rewards. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So meanwhile, people had the time to gather some more questions. I have a list, and I would think at the moment we have enough time to go one by one. So the first one is Alexandra Zeitz. Can you unmute yourself, or no? So I have to unmute you. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for this presentation. So I have two, I'm Alexandra Zeitz. I'm a Max Weber Fellow here at the EUI. So I have two questions that have to do sort of with this notion of mission. And I was wondering a bit about, I was struck by the fact that right at the end you said, it's often easiest at the level of a city or a region, because then it becomes clear sort of who the mission is serving. And I was thinking about some of the tools that can be mission oriented. You pointed to development banks. And of course, another one we might think of are export finance institutions. But precisely because they start to bridge from one country into another, the question of whose interests are served really come to the forefront. And I think about the fact that sort of Chinese export finance has been very much driven at fostering sort of the development of Chinese firms, but is then called into question in borrowing countries because perhaps it's not sort of creating value in borrowing countries. And so I just thought of that as an example for thinking about, at what level of analysis are we thinking about the mission and for whom value is being created given these different tools. And then my second question about this question of mission is, I think you made a very helpful distinction between sort of objective and subjective in unfolding economic history, and you placed a lot of emphasis in understanding objectively what the actual relationships are in the economy. But missions are normative statements, right? Mm-hmm. So discursively, I wonder how do you go from saying these are the actual relationships, these are the firms, and these are the workers, but then a normative claim that it ought to be distributed a certain way, or it ought to be directed in a certain towards certain ends. So how you shift from that diagnostic objective assessment to then the normative claim that a mission should serve a certain purpose.
Wow, that was really good. I wish I guess you have recorded the question. I want to see it written down later. I'm going to use it to all the people that I talked to about it. So fantastic question. I'll begin with the second part, actually, because it's related to the first. So missions are normative in terms of what's to be done, but the how actually calls for an objective, right? So the paper that I put up there called The People's Prescription, which you can get off of Google, kind of made the point, one thing is to talk about mission-oriented policy, and that's basically just about the directions, right? What are the big missions that we're going after? How do you create missions around the SDGs? And the point there was simply, we don't have the right framing because all the tools that we have, again, pretend that it's all just about leveling. So what does it mean to have tools that are tilting? What does it mean for how you think about, public, private, et cetera, all the stuff I talked about. But what this paper did on the People's Prescription was saying, what does this mean for production, right? So if we're producing drugs, coming back to the objective, if we have large state actors like the National Institutes of Health, big pharma, small biotech, some intermediary organizations, some institutional funds, what would it look like to think about if you start with the goal of what's to be produced, right? Because even in the agriculture, even in the physiocrats, I said they have an objective perception of where value is coming from, but what value they wanted to create was, you could say, subjective in the sense they wanted, they decided they wanted to focus more on agriculture. They didn't, what then created a shift in that to industrial was some choices that, if you want, were made. So there's always been a normative in terms of what's to be done, but the how it's done and who owns what and why, who's doing what and why, that's the kind of objective versus subjective. And what we argue in that people's prescription is that actually having a more objective lens of who's doing what and how we might actually rethink that who's doing what would be useful for then thinking about how we're actually going to deliver the big picture, right? So if you want to put in all this public money, which is there, like that's just a fact, to achieve certain goals, then how you govern that production system from a mission-oriented lens will be very different from how you govern it from just, let's just get a lot of private and public to kind of work together around health innovation lens. And that's why, by the way, it's so interesting to look at how differently the Department of Defense funds health, because they do, like soldiers, when they go to war, they get sick, right? So the Department of Defense, not health, funds a lot of military health funding. And they're super mission oriented. They do not get screwed by the pharmaceutical companies. The prices of the drugs that the military is kind of producing reflects that military contribution. And the patents are structured precisely in the ways that people like Dick Nelson argues for, which is that patents should be very weak and narrow, not strong and wide. And they shouldn't be so upstream that they block innovation itself because the knowledge is being kind of privatized, right? So patents do have a function, but not if you misgovern them. And what's interesting, in history, we see that when there were strong missions and urgencies of what had to be done, then the innovation and production process was governed in a very different way. In terms of the first question, I was just going to put up a sharing screen again, because I could show you a slide, which I didn't show, which is in the second report I wrote for the commission around governing missions. The first question was, who decides? Is this like the benevolent dictator decides what's to be done? Going to the moon and back again, great Kennedy moment. Or given the first question, is it actually more of a stakeholder kind of cooperative thing where we actually bring different voices to the tables? I was actually just giving a talk this morning to a large trade union gathering. Al Sharpton was giving one of the keynotes. It was quite interesting, precisely on this question. Where's the worker's voice, if you want, today when we're thinking about a green transition? Unfortunately, it's not really there. So trade unions have almost been forced into this ex post reaction of just arguing for a just transition, which is a very important point, which is that as you transit from a dirty to a clean economy, many people will be left behind. We need to be investing in human capital so that all types of workers can then transit towards a greener economy. But they weren't at the table even defining what green is. So this kind of pushback against the experts deciding everything and how we can actually bring movements, social movements, green movements, to the table, at least with some of these missions that are more societal and that really need buy-in, otherwise they don't work. It just doesn't catalyze that kind of real inspirational thinking that the moon landing did, where that famous example of the janitor in the NASA building saying, I'm also helping someone get to the moon, or all the inspiration to study STEM subjects that happen in schools. That's because the mission actually meant something to people. But increasingly, it's just not about just inspirational speech like Kennedy's in Rice Stadium. It's about really interacting with empathy with citizens and talking to them about what people kind of want, which doesn't mean a referendum. And believe me, with Brexit now, I kind of doubt sometimes what we do referendums on, but it does mean finding ways, new democratic channels, citizen assemblies and others, to bring new voices to the table on the what's to be done. And that kind of, it doesn't solve the problem that you're mentioning, but I think it's also about the degree to which a government is willing to render itself vulnerable to hearing differing opinions. And in my experience is governments are not good at that at all. But also we should remember, I think I mentioned in passing that shale gas and fracking was government financed. That point is important because the point should not be, oh, government's great, government funds all this stuff. Governments also fund a lot of shitty stuff. And so by admitting that governments can be transformational, can create and shape markets, not just fix them, the first thing we should be aware of are where the checks and balances on what is being financed. And so the more we can bring new citizen kind of groups and cooperatives and that whole kind of stakeholder capitalism thing to the table, the more we'll ideally have some checks and balances in that way. But there's no easy answer. It's always going to be a very tense process full of conflict. And sorry, just lastly, because you mentioned the fund, I mean, one of the big things in Norway, for example, with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's a big pot of public money, there's been a huge pushback against that because it's basically financing a lot of real estate and easy investments. And the idea is if you have a mission-oriented public fund, it should be funding all those opportunities that are going to create a better way of living for future generations, not putting the money into the fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. So it's about, I think, having those debates and bringing them to the table precisely because it's government funding.
Thank you very much. Next one, Sebastian. You need to ask me to unmute you. I'm sorry.
I think, yes, I just asked
Perfect.
you.
Excellent, yeah.
Thank you very much, Doro, and thank you very much for the very insightful talk. I'm Sebastian Diesel. I'm also a Max Weber Fellow here, working more on macroeconomic policy, monetary fiscal coordination. So some of the things that Josh Ryan Collins has also written very interesting stuff about. I would just be curious to hear from you your views on what has been going on or is going on in France at the moment in terms of the entreprise à mission. Basically, a change in law last year, allowing companies to go from a sort of, well, shareholder value maximization model to at least add some stakeholder value. I'm not sure if maximization, but at least appreciation. And Danone essentially picking up on that, and the shareholders last week basically agreeing or consenting to the fact that they will not be prioritized, but it's not just about shareholder value maximization anymore. That would sound exactly like the way to go, but I wonder if it is the way to go or whether there's reason we should be suspicious about that.
Yeah, I mean, what I was mentioning in the beginning with the Business Roundtable is there is change. I mean, especially, I'd say it almost began with Unilever under Paul Polman, a real, at least more, I don't want to say honest, but when they talked about stakeholder value, they said this has to be throughout our whole value chain. It can't just be kind of icing on the cake, corporate social responsibility, or even ESG targets that kind of after the fact just kind of tick boxes. And I think the problem is that until it's really systemic, transparent, and mandatory, then unfortunately, as I said, it kind of remains patchy. And patchy is fine as long as changes in Danone become like a good model for other companies to follow, but especially within France, become a new way for public to relate one to another. I think that's where it becomes corporate governance and stakeholder value mean for how we organize capitalism, literally in terms of public-private interactions. And so I think that's why this COVID moment now in France has been more how it's in some other countries, including Italy, where there's been in some ways a failure to put stakeholder governance at the center of how the government distributed the funds basically to business. Again, if you look at the difference in the Renault deal in France with the FCA, Fiat Chrysler deal in Italy, it's hugely different. And the first thing Macron said was, we're not here to save companies, we're here to transform them. But, some people may be like, oh, who does he think he is? But that's the point. You can, if able to transform them. You can't transform them if it's, government just telling everyone what to do. It's, hey, if you want access to this immense social infrastructure and benefits and bailouts and loans and grants, well, guess what? You're going to have to change. And not micromanage that change, because that kills innovation, right? Innovation works best when there's a real kind of goal, but then how you get there is up to you. So that stimulates a lot of bottom-up thinking and creativity. So again, the design of how you do this really matters, because you can squash creativity and dynamism and innovation if it becomes literally very top-down. But I do find it very interesting within Europe to see the massive difference in how this is being done. And the UK, there's almost no conditionality right now. And so to see how we can take this out of just the Danone moment to more doing capitalism differently moment, and France sticking to its guns and in some ways providing, I don't want to say leadership, because it's not like everything they're doing is perfect, but it's definitely a different way of thinking.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then the next is Annabelle.
Thank you. I think Eniola was first, actually.
Yeah, she was in and out, and I tried to. Okay, Eniola. So Eniola, maybe we start with you. You are muted. Sorry for.
Okay, thanks, guys. Thank you so much for your talk. It was so interesting. I'm not an economist or an economic historian, so it was really illuminating for me. And I wonder if you could, I'm a Max Weber Fellow, by the way. I was wondering if you could say more in more concrete terms about the different forms of capitalism that might be envisioned, because I'm thinking of the ways in which, so you talk about objectives, which I'm choosing to call ends, just because when I hear the word objective, I think of it in a more philosophical sense. And what strikes me are the ways in which a lot of the talk that you're focusing on, value creation, the conflation between value and price, is so very historically situated. And you're very specifically talking about a European history. And I'm wondering about the ways in which, for instance, specific countries on any specific mission, as you're calling them, sets particular ends, which are, say, for instance, not necessarily in contradiction, but don't agree with ends or mission objectives set in different countries, coming from different historical perspectives and understandings of values. How do you create global structures in which the ends set by one historical situation don't jar with or get subsumed by or contradict another setting's ends to the point where it's detrimental in a local context, but then it's unmanageable in a global situation? I don't know if I'm expressing myself coherently enough. I guess I'm just wondering the extent to which to which we have sort of normative structures of understanding that subsumes both this understanding of recalibrating ourselves to view value based on mission ends, but also in ways that ask us to envisage objectivity about value creation in a specifically historicized way, and and structures that also allow us to counteract failures in this when they happen.
That was so interesting. Are you a philosopher? Oh, I'm hearing an echo. Do you hear an echo?
Yes. Can you try again?
Okay, I can talk. Yes, good. Okay, I can talk. And you good. Okay, anyway, I'm hearing it again. Do you hear it?
Yeah, we hear this echo too.
I think it might be, let's see, with Eniola muted, let's see if it works. Okay. I think Eniola, we might have a sound thing, so I won't ask you any questions. So thank you so much. I would love to talk to you further offline about that, actually, because it sounds like I have more to learn from you on this question. So I'll try to make some sense. So I don't know. I mean, first of all, that's not my specialty. I'll just come out and say I'm not. And I think, unfortunately, within my area of economics, so the innovation kind of industrial dynamics, we have been way too Euro, Anglo kind of focused. The work I'm doing now in South Africa as an advisor to President Ramaphosa, I'm realizing both how different the situations are, even like the structures of the state-owned enterprises, but also how and their remits, how they're thought about, what the role of the state is, also the worry about state, not just interference, but the state getting kind of captured actually along the way by different interests. All these things can be talked about, you know, also in Italy, we've had a long-standing worries about, say, corruption and state capture, but how it lands in a particular country has a lot to do with its history, right? So there's no one kind of analysis that one can talk about in terms of what is the role of the state in modern capitalism. It actually depends on the local context and how it's been lived in terms of the form of capitalism. So the first thing is just to recognize you're absolutely right, and we can't aggregate away from that. and any mission setting, if it doesn't think and understand and interact with those forces and understandings, then is going to be, you know, at worst or at best kind of top down, at worst completely not effective. I mean, it's just not going to, again, land in any sort of form of understanding of how society works. But having said that, my experience, my limited experience in working, for example, across the world and different continents now, not so much in terms of the history you were talking about, but at least the comparative, how do you say, cross country kind of work, it feels like there's lots of similarities, more than I was expecting. This point, for example, the worry that government will crowd out business, or the worry about picking winners, or the worry about government failure being even bigger than market failure, I've seen everywhere. You know, whether it was in Brazil, again, in South Africa, at the city level, the regional level, the national level. So it seems to be that the force of traditional economic framings of what the state is for and how it's then taught, whether it's in business schools or economics departments worldwide, has been quite powerful in framing both the objectives, but also the worry of what not to do, not just what to do, but what not to do. And that's where I have focused my work, which is to kind of, in speaking, because we often have big committee rooms, or not committee rooms, how do you say, 30 people around a table in a particular context talking about what is of interest in the particular country or city, and then what the worries are. And to me, it feels like the lack of really interesting granular thinking of what the state is for, of the type that I mentioned, does occur in particular organizations like the BBC, where it's a huge debate, and they have had, you know, like 40 years of discussion of how to measure public value. Is it okay or not to do a soap opera or not? There's so little of that. There's so little granular thinking, which then gets scaled up in how we teach. Whereas on the business side, there's lots of that, right? And there's lots of case studies all around the world, in developing countries and developed in different parts of the continent, of what do we know about how business works. And, you know, the whole Harvard case study thing is global. They have examples all over the world in different contexts. I feel like it's a whole research area in terms of just gathering almost the field evidence of what works, what doesn't, and why in the state structures, literally from a public broadcaster to a public bank to a digital agency like the one I mentioned in Barcelona that was really ambitious. And I think the more we can do that, the more we can start also unveiling some properties that are almost just really global and that have to do with certain kind of factors that are quite constant, and others that are very, very deeply dependent on, you know, whether it's culture or, again, development phase or, you know, all sorts of different kind of social, historical, cultural elements, which economists have very little knowledge about, but we could just say that mattered, and we don't know much about it, but it sure, you know, that's what mattered to the success of that organization. So all this is just to say there's a huge ignorance in terms of the kind of public administration side and how all the factors that you talk about matter, because there's just almost little case studies, because we haven't bothered to see them as value creating institutions and just almost as regulators or you know, maybe a state-owned enterprise, and just, you know, not really reflecting on, given that it's state-owned, how should it think about its portfolio and its investment in a different way from that same kind of company operating with a portfolio lens in that same sector. So what is a public portfolio and risk reward distribution? How is that different from a private one? There's just very little on that, even generically, let alone deep down on the specificities.
Okay, just to give you a framework, we still have maximum 15 minutes. So I think I will bring in a few questions from the YouTube before I then go back to the room again. And I bundled them. So there was one which was a kind of follow-up on what you on your answer to Eniola. Not entirely sure to Eniola's question, but so you talked a lot about how do you get the state basically, how do you convince the state into you know, becoming entrepreneurial, but how do you convince business? So how do you basically uh, uh, convince private entities to invest in activities that will benefit the public interest without them making huge profits. So how do you pick partners? How do you find them? And this is one of the questions. And another question also from YouTube was, I mean, there is this debate about degrowth, right? So if you really want to go into green growth, this debate says we can actually not grow anymore. We have to actively think about degrowth. So what is your take on that? Maybe you can take these two questions together.
Yeah. Okay, good, thanks. I'm glad you didn't choose 9 questions because then I always have a hard time remembering.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first one about, you know, how do you convince business? I mean, it depends what we're talking about. So it's not about business not making profits. Otherwise, that's something else, you know, charities or whatever. So one thing is in mapping the risks and rewards, it could be that part of this work is about asking how much profit is right? So just take the venture capital industry. And I'm thinking of this more from, well, anyway, take the venture capital sector, this kind of 2-20 model that they make 2% no matter what happens and 20% for the successful ones, then that 2% for doing nothing and 20% when it goes well. One could ask, given that venture capital is often on the back of early stage, more risk-taking public funds, what would be the right distribution of rewards in that model, right? So that would just be one example where the point is to say, not you guys make no profits, but once we do recognize the fundamental role that an early stage, high risk public fund took, what would be a better distribution of sharing of the rewards, given that we actually then admit that there was other actors there doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So that's just one part of the answer. But in terms of getting, you know, picking the willing and not picking winners, how do you partner? I mean, I was fascinated in this new book that I'm writing actually on the Apollo moonshot and asking what are the lessons we can learn from how public and private interacted, where it was just so much more ambitious. I mean, it's not that General Electric, Motorola, and Honeywell didn't make money. Of course they made money. Otherwise they wouldn't have done it. But they were operating in that area because government had a problem it needed solved, and government gave them a contract to solve it. And when they solved it badly, NASA just threw it back to them. Sorry, do it again. It's no good. And again, the price charged or the contracts in terms of the funds, they were fair, and there was still a healthy profit being made, but there was kind of a lack of this rent that one could argue, which is often coming back to my point about storytelling. If you look at the rents, which I at least see in the pharmaceutical industry, it's also this kind of narrative and confidence that even in a country like the US that puts all that public money into health innovation, they then buy into the idea, oh, that it's big pharma that is actually producing all the innovation. So of course they should be, you know, putting whatever price tag they want at it. And then we just bring the price down through negotiation of, you know, like in the UK, they do it through a particular body called NICE, N-I-C-E. So that's a much less efficient way to think about it than if you're going to put in all this money, then that price has to be right in the first place. You shouldn't have to allow it to be charged and then have this whole very lengthy bureaucratic procedure to then bring it down in one country and not down in another, and a bit of gaming along the way. So it's about getting the right price or the right profit given who's doing what and why. And third, as I was saying, in terms of the conditionalities, if you don't want to play, then go away. You don't get a bailout. You know, I mean, it is a bit of an upper hand. And the reason I say the COVID moment is important is government will never have such an upper hand for a long time. Huge amounts, you know, trillions are being put into the system. The more we can think of how to introduce those conditionalities in order to benefit from them, not as a big stick, but as a, you know, much more quid pro quo, you know, kind of healthy deal making as opposed to just parasitic. So more symbiotic, less parasitic. That should be, if it's conditional, then that's the answer to your question. That's why business will go along with it, because they're not going to access the funds. And even pre-COVID, you won't access huge amounts of public money in digital technology and health technology and renewable technology unless you play the game. And it's not, again, about micromanaging that game, because that could kill growth. It would kill innovation. It would stifle, because it's too, you know, it's too top down. But definitely having that target and making sure that business behavior evolves and is transformed in order to help us reach that target, that should just be part of the deal. And if you're not interested, see ya.
Okay, the degrowth.
Oh, sorry, degrowth. Yes, yeah, I told you I forget it, even when it's true.
No, I fully understand.
So, I mean, degrowth, I'm just not a fan of the concept because it's never been the problem, right? The problem is, you know, has always been the kind of growth we have. So the financial crisis was not caused by too much growth. It was caused by, you know, a really problematic form of growth, which partly I talked about in the beginning, which also led to record level private debt to disposable income, which, by the way, we have again. If you imagine some of these missions, if you really had, you know, a mission around the circular economy in a carbon neutral city, in 100 carbon neutral regions in a country, that actually requires a lot of new activities. So just think of the steel example I gave. You know, one thing would be just get rid of steel completely. Another thing would be there will be a transition towards the end of certain types of sectors, but along the way you repurpose, recycle, and reuse. So those would all be green activities: repurpose, reuse, recycle steel, which could cause growth because these are new types of activities that don't exist. In fact, the whole recycling industry remains a bit, I don't want to say backwards, but it's not really the most high-tech part of our society, right? So if we create, or maintenance, my colleague Carlotta Perez often talks about the need to get out of the mentality of, in Italian you would say usa e getta, you know, use and throw out. If you really start maintaining existing equipment, instead of just throwing out a refrigerator, we fix it as we used to do when markets were limited. Now that markets have massively expanded with growing middle classes, there can be actually a greater market for these items that are repurposed. That requires a whole new set of skills and activity. And in doing that, it causes growth, right? So it's all about, and I know it's not easy. It's not like, oh, don't worry about it. Let's just, you know, recycle our way out of this. But if you have really strong objectives around a green, sustainable economy, that can create new opportunities, new landscapes, new opportunities for collaboration and investment, which will get us the right kind of growth. But saying degrowth, I've never seen anyone properly argue how it would not create a massive unemployment and inequality and kind of productivity problem. And that's not to say that that's all we should worry about. We should focus on the objective, which is greening our entire value chain. But if you do it ambitiously, inspirationally, with a mission-oriented approach, it creates inspiration, it creates expectations of future ways of working and thinking that can catalyze growth. But that's why you need a really strategic and designed thinking kind of lens to it. It's not just going to happen by saying, let's go green.
Thank you. So I think I still have 4 people on the list. And I would say we close the list then, because this has been a long exercise. So it's Annabelle first.
Thank you. So I'm a Max Weber Fellow as well. I mostly work on issues related to citizen engagement, the power of bureaucrats, and local politicians in public policy. I'm glad I got Eniola to talk first, because actually my question is very related, but I'm going to ask in a much more practical way. So throughout the whole talk, I wondered about value trade-offs. And I think especially COVID, for example, really highlighted that, as in, like, for example, valuing life versus like valuing livelihoods, right? And so you made this comment earlier, this idea of like, or this acknowledgement that there will always be a lot of conflict, like having to negotiate these values and to come up with a mission. Now, most of the times policymakers tend not to have an appetite for conflict, and especially in, you know, polarized settings or in crisis settings. So I think like Merkel, for example, is a great example now, where maybe she's held on for so long and actually managed to keep her approval ratings up because there was a continuous evasion of conflict, actually. So when you work with policymakers, how do you increase their appetite for such conflict? And what are your suggestions on how to manage that?
Good point. Should I answer this one, Dodo?
Or do you prefer to collect? And I remind you of the
Maybe
main.
I'll be quick. I'll be quick. Otherwise, I think I'm going to see now. So thank you for also picking up again on the question before, which I thought was so good and which I didn't probably respond to very well. So the first thing is just to recognize that there is no one value, right? I mean, that's what you're saying. There's going to be multiple. There's going to be, as Eniola was saying, whether it's based on cultural or just diverse, value propositions within a particular area. How does one kind of navigate that? And the other issue, though, is around conflict. And I think they're related in the sense that how we, at least historically, have gone in one way or another hasn't been just due to some deterministic forces. There's been choices that are being made, and by definition, other choices that are not being made. And even just admitting that that's a situation as opposed to some technological determinism or political determinism. So bringing back agency to the table, I think, is always important, because it makes us all realize that everything we're doing is due to an outcome of some decisions, and those decisions could have been done differently. I mean, when I speak to policymakers, one thing is even just to remind them in my world, like innovation world, that so many of the biggest innovations came from struggle and people died. The biggest social innovation of our time is the weekend. People died for that. The 8-hour workday, people died for that. Children not working in factories, people died for that. But even the birth control pill, without the feminist movement, would not have happened. The AIDS drug, without ACT UP, the movement, would not have happened. So I think that's, again, even for us, I think we're mainly academics in this setting here, reminding ourselves that we probably, even in the history of innovation and kind of economic history, not really paid enough attention to what the role of social movements has been in progress, right? And if that's true, once we admit that's true, then what does that mean for the skills you need within policy? Like literally the empathy 101 class. And by empathy, I don't mean like sympathy, like, I mean empathy, like shut up and listen and learn and put yourself in the position of the students or the green movement or the trade unions or whoever is, saying we need change. Stop, listen, put yourself in their shoes, interact, and then think, do we need to do things differently? There's no training, at least that I've seen, in the Masters in Public Administration or Masters in Public Policy around that. So it's not enough to say governments aren't good at that. It's what is the new tools that they need to become good at that, especially in an age of Black Lives Matter and Fridays of the Future, where just two very recent movements, which I think have inspired as much as made us sad in terms of then maybe the lack of change. But the first thing is to recognize that that's a source of progress. That conflict, it's not about tapping it, smushing it out just so we can all pretend we're all in it together. But first of all, we're not all in it together. All these changes always affect people in different ways, but also the diversity of opinion is central, but also the fighting for particular rights or ways of thinking about value is what has gotten us in the past progress. And if you make that point strongly and document it as much as possible, that's what wakes policymakers up, like, oh, I better do that. I can't just rely on, digital and industry 4.0 and illuminated civil servants to move us. We need to interact properly with social movements. But I'm sure as with Eniola, more than I do on on the value issues behind that. But that's why I spoke this morning to this big trade union organization. It's because I sincerely believe actually that workers' voices, literally think of it, the old capital labor, they still exist as concepts, and working class still exists. We don't talk about the working class. We pretend it's all about other things. That's, in my world, hardly no real discussion. So trade unions were not at the table, really, with the European missions. And yet the bigger question is, what's the modern form of trade unions that we need, right? So how those same organizations should evolve and become more progressive forces, less about protecting old categories.
This could lead to a beginning of a whole nother conversation, but we don't want to do this to you. Maybe we bundle now, because I think we are really coming to the end. So it's Ellie, Giacomo and Adelaide. I take you all together, and then let Mariana decide what you want to answer and for how long. Okay, so Ellie, you are the first.
Thank you, Doru. So my question is also, as a public policy scholar, quite a practical one, and it links back to Alexa's question about the tension between the kind of subjective mission and then how the objective measures that you use to kind of achieve that mission, essentially. So I work on public-private partnerships, where it's a big problem, and you're looking at kind of where there are big unknowns or a new goal or a new mission or something that's unknown, how you're able to kind of contract fully enough for the private side of the partnership to be able to actually undertake what they say they will do. So I think the terms you were using, kind of move from the talk to the walk. I was wondering if you could illustrate with some examples of how, for example, the conditionalities you mentioned, what an effective way of structuring them would be, so that the private side of these types of collaborations are really held to account.
Okay, then Giacomo.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I'm also Max Weber in law. And my question is about, I guess, what you referred to in your answer to Annabelle. How do you get, administrator and public agency to listen and learn? And there is, in my field, literature that has a lot of faith in institutional design and designing institutions that force, like things like peer review, and especially the transnational dimension. So the biggest hopes for learning are in transnational settings where, let's say, competition authorities listen to each other what they do and may sort of revise their practices or learn from each other. So I wonder whether, in terms of, we need states to learn and to learn how to learn, and whether you have also faith in institutional design and transnational networks.
Okay, and Adelaide.
Okay, thank you. Well, somebody was asking you, how can we incentive industries in investing in public and in state? But my point is, during coronavirus, we saw a lot the technological field, the technological industry investing a lot in healthcare. For example, creating app necessary for mapping the virus, etc. So it was a great occasion for the technological sector, providing a solution for the government. But on the other hand, we have given to them a lot of information. There is a problem with privacy. There is a huge problem with the monopoly power of high tech and the value extraction of these giants. So my question, knowing that you have worked with these topics, is which should be the role of the state? How should the state behave in this kind of a new occasion?
Great. Well, thank you again. Great questions. So beginning with Ellie, I mean, maybe I could just point to you some stuff we've written on this. So the idea that we worked on with WHO, the World Health Organization, around the vaccine, which we ended up calling the People's Vaccine on the back of that report we wrote 2 years ago, the People's Prescription, was all about how do you design this is also about Giacomo's question, how can you bring institutional design to the question of how to make sure that the way that public and private interact is in fact, achieving what we want, because the details matter, the contracts matter, the form of the partnership, the design of the partnership matters. So the idea, for example, to have a common patent pool instead of competition, so more solidarity between all these different projects, from the one in Italy to the one in Oxford to the ones globally, that requires a certain type of sharing of the intellectual property rights, which could be embedded within, again, the contracts. You cannot take part of this big kind of, exercise that we put under the heading race for the vaccine, but actually requires lots of international collaboration unless you agree to certain criteria, including the patent pooling, so that there's real sharing of knowledge, which nurtures more collective intelligence, which doesn't only help us get there quicker, but then the form that the learning that occurs along the way is greater, more spillovers, etc. And so Giacomo, I mean, everything I do is actually only because I believe in institutional design. If I didn't believe in institutional design, I would have never set up the institute, which is set up, which is actual department, which is all about thinking, what are the design challenges? In fact, our MPA has 4 modules. One is on public value, one is on grand challenges, one is on, on digital and design. Okay, what's the fourth one? Forgetting. I'm blanking out today. Anyway, one is all about design. And the idea is that none of these, there is no such thing as like the role of the public sector or the effect of the public sector. It depends on the design, not only of the public sector, but of the collaborations between it and other organizations. And the law, the law is central to that. I hosted one of these COVID workshops that we hosted was with Caterina Pistor, who's just written a fantastic book called The Code of Capital. I really recommend it to you all. And we looked at the kind of legal and institutional underpinnings behind exactly then coming to Adelaide's question that are underpinning the rents and the monopoly power. Monopoly power is not just about, getting rid of, big tech. It's about looking at how they have benefited because of the design of the institutions and the contracts from this, again, massive collective wealth creating machine, and been able to, including the design of the tax system, but also design of all sorts of other things, benefit from that. So kind of bringing that agency back to the table that I've been talking about before is about a real call for redesigning these systems, because nothing is inevitable in that. But definitely looking at the conditions around the vaccine development that we've been working on, I think is useful. I think it's interesting, Giacomo, that you said peer review, because that's exactly one of the things that we talk about with the vaccine work, that we wouldn't have progress in science without peer review. And a lot of the ways in which patents are being abused today by large companies is precisely kind of bringing us back to the Middle Ages before peer review, before those that sharing. And also real kind of metrics for making sure that the process isn't being impeded. But just lastly with Adelaide, the tech sector, they haven't been that important, obviously, with the vaccine, but definitely with the app and stuff like that. And so thinking about, technology is not neutral. Finance isn't neutral, by the way. We've done a lot of work on showing how the structure of finance determines what happens in the real economy, but the structure, how we govern a technology and an app. I was quite struck actually how some countries are willing to talk about how are we going to govern, the COVID app, and others are just like, no, we just need a quick fix, just bring in the app. And then a lot of, crap happens because they didn't worry about that kind of governance from a public good perspective. But the more we can make sure that that then affects the who gets what and why, but also not just in terms of money, but the benefits that citizens receive. And so just quickly, one of the reasons that I invited quite a few practitioners to teach on our NPA was that people like Mike Bracken, who set up what became Government Digital Services, so gov.uk, it's a website of the UK government. The first thing he said was, in designing this website, which is for the public sector, we need to combat the view of citizens as clients or customers, right? So this customerization of students in schools or clientelization of patients in hospital, that then determines the design of the hospital and the school. So as soon as you say citizens are going to use this gov.uk and increase their participation in receiving their welfare benefits, whether it's, classic welfare benefits or even just getting your motor vehicles license or passport, how you design that website will determine how people experience the state. But also in focusing on citizens as users and not as clients or customers, he said even just that, and I don't find user as a very inspirational term for citizens. It's more about human rights, but also using the site itself, that affected how they completely redesigned it. So technology is not neutral, it's governed by assumptions even of who we think citizens are and what rights they have, what human rights they have. Anyway, I think we're all tired.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful tour de force. I think, there was so much in this that we have food for thought for the rest of the year. For those of you who are still want to ask more questions or want to use the other opportunity, I once again tell that today, I think at 7:30 London time, 6:30 London time, so 7:30 our time, Mariana will be in another meeting rebuilding from the bottom up the role of civic engagement and regional government in responding to COVID-19. So you can maybe join her there if you couldn't ask your question here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mariana. This was amazing. Thank you very, very much. And also thank you, Yashwani, Francesca, and Neri for setting the technology of the STEM thing up. As I said, I wish we can at one point in future repeat this in person, but it's been I mean, thank you just so very much for doing this.
No, thank you guys. And especially, I love that we could bring together Rethinking Economics with the Max Planck Fellow. So thank you all for allowing that. And also, if you are interested tonight, you actually have to register. So, because we can only have 500 registrants. So just do it. Anyway,
Excellent.
thank you so much. And hopefully for any of you who want to get in touch, you know, please do. I'm not very good at answering all my emails, but someone will get back to you. No, I will. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.